All right, welcome everyone to our first Lunch and Learn webinar for 2024. It's a little bit late to say Happy New Year because we're almost at the end of February, but we are so glad that you come back to spend lunchtime with us and join us for our webinar today. My name is Sonja Hodis. I am your moderator and a condo lawyer, and I'm joined today by a great panel of speakers who have graciously volunteered their time to share their knowledge and experience with you today. Today's webinar is really inspired by some stories that we've been seeing in the media recently. We've all heard or seen stories about owners faced with unexpected special assessments in the tens of thousands of dollars for major repairs and replacement to the common elements because the condo simply just did not have enough money in their bank account, aka their reserve fund, to pay for these necessary repairs or replacement. And we all know that no one wants to be in this position, not the board, not the property manager, and definitely not the owners. But it seems like these stories are happening more often these days, both across Canada and in the US. And along with these stories, we're also hearing about the rising costs of just about everything in our lives, including construction costs, due to inflation and many other factors. But unfortunately, we're not hearing in the news about some miraculous rising reserve fund balances. So, as I said, these stories are what really inspired today's webinar, and we were wondering whether there was something that condos could do proactively to prolong the service life of their common elements so that they could better manage these increasing costs, and whether these options that are available were a good strategy or not. So, in order to answer those questions, we've invited Chris MacMillan, Jon Dickson, Jeff Livingstone, and Jeremy Nixon to share their thoughts on this topic, as well as their strategies about how a condo could prolong common element life when it comes to concrete, windows, and building cladding, as well as mechanical building systems. And those are the areas that we're going to really focus on today in today's webinar. Now, if you are in a situation where you have to do a major repair or replacement of your common elements right now, this webinar is not going to help you because today's really about being proactive, not reactive. So if you're thinking about what you can do to plan for the future, today's webinar is going to be a great resource. And speaking of resources, I want to take this opportunity to thank a very valuable resource that we have at CCI Huronia, and that is our sponsors. As you have heard me say time and time again, without the support of our sponsors, we are not able to provide these webinars free of charge to you. And so thank you to our sponsors, Integrity Property Management, Nordic Windows and Doors, Select Path Insurance, Aaliyah Associates Condominium Lawyers, and Aegis. If you want to find out any information about these sponsors, you can go to our website, and on our landing page, you'll see their logos at the bottom of the page, as well as you'll find them on the event page for today's webinar. Just click on their logo, that'll take you to their websites, and you can find out more information about the services that they provide, as well as their contact information. So thanks again to our sponsors for supporting CCI Huronia. We have many property managers joining us today, and I just wanted to remind all of you that this webinar is approved for CMRAO CPD credits. It is worth 1 CPE credit. So if you're a property manager in Ontario and you're watching this webinar today live, if you want to put your name, first and last name, as well as your company name in the chat box, please put it in the chat box, not the Q&A box. This will confirm your attendance for our records at the webinar, and then you will need to go to your account on the CMRAO website to self-report your attendance. You do not need a certificate of attendance from us to be able to do that, but it is important that you do put your name in the chat box just so that we have a record that you attended the live webinar. Also, just to let all of you know that our webinars for March, May, and June of this year have also been approved for CMRAO CPD credits. So if you haven't registered for those webinars, go to our website, ccihuronia.com, and register. The links for registration are all open at this time. And thanks again to our sponsors, because we're able to offer these courses to you free of charge because of their generous support. If this is your first time joining us on one of these webinars, let me just tell you who the Canadian Condominium Institute is, CCI. We are an independent nonprofit organization formed in 1982, And we have chapters across the country, 8 alone in Ontario, and CCI Huronia is one of those Ontario chapters. Our main objective is education, but we also advocate for owners, and we represent all those involved in condos, from owners to directors to professionals, and we encourage all these stakeholders to work together. If you are not a member of CCI and you want to experience the benefits of membership, check out one of your local chapters and consider joining today. You can find a chapter near you at the national website, cci.ca, or if you want to become a member of CCI Huronia, and we would love for you to do so, you can go directly to our website at ccihuronia.com, click on the membership tab, and you can become a member online with a few clicks. Also, CCI National has a resource center that is available on the national website, or you can link to it through our website. This is a great resource for information that has been posted from members of our chapters across the country. CCI Huronia has a Facebook page, so don't forget to follow and like us on Facebook. We also have a newsletter, which can be found on our website, called Condo Buzz. And if you've missed any of our previous webinars, you can always find recordings of our past webinars on our website under the Resource Content tab. And today's webinar will be recorded and available in the next 7 to 10 days. Our webinars are also available on YouTube, and we really, really want to grow our YouTube channel and love to hit that 1,000 subscriber mark. So if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, get over to YouTube, just search CCI Huronia, you'll see our channel. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you like our videos. Don't forget to hit the bell so you know when we post new videos, and please share the videos with anyone that you think may benefit from the information contained therein. And finally, just a reminder to everyone today that the information provided in today's webinar is general information, and it may not apply to your specific fact situation. So if you are a condo director and you want to use the protection of Section 37 of the Condominium Act, you do need to get an opinion about your specific situation from your own professionals. This webinar is not intended to provide you with opinions that protect you under Section 37 of the Act. In addition, because this is being recorded and people will be watching it at a later date, all the information in this webinar is current as of February 23rd, 2024. Things may change, so please make sure you check with your professionals to make sure that the information is still current and relevant. And also, please be advised that if you are watching this webinar outside of the province of Ontario, all references to the Condominium Act or any other legislation is a reference to Ontario legislation. So before we get started, just another reminder, if you're a property manager, put your name in the chat box so that we can record your attendance. And then we're going to get started with our first speaker, who is Chris MacMillan from Avid Capital Reserve Planning, Inc. And Chris is going to start us off and give us a general overview of what condos are dealing with now, what you should be looking for, and what you need to think about. Chris?
Thanks. Well, first off, I have some relatively good news to share. The fourth quarter building construction price index has recently been released by Statistics Canada. And inflation in 2023 was not as high as it was in 2022 and 2021, which they were about 22% and 26% for residential. So the residential construction inflation year over year for 2023 was 10.08%, which unfortunately was still much higher than the long-term average of 4.66%, but at least it's trending in the right direction. So yes, we have seen exorbitant increases in costs in recent years, which has led to a shortfall in funding for many corporations. That is funding from operations if the work involves minor repairs or other maintenance, or funding from the reserve fund if the work involves major repair and replacement. This shortfall can be realized in the short term when reviewing the bids for recently tendered work and comparing those costs to your current fund balances or past budgets. But it can crop up for the long term when the reserve fund study is updated with current costs and inflation rates are applied to future work. A shortfall in funding generally leads to an increase in monthly contributions and or loan or special assessment and displeased owners. So what can be done to limit those increases? Can the corporation just not do the work and avoid those high expenditures? Well, under Section 89 of the Act, the corporation has an obligation to repair and replace after damage or failure the units and common elements or the components as stipulated in the declaration. So that said, there is a potential that the high replacement or major rehabilitation work costs could be deferred by prolonging the life of components. So where do you look or who do you look to for guidance in regards to timing of work? So one place you can look is the reserve fund study. Reserve fund studies are conducted to determine if the amount of contributions collected by the corporation are adequate. And then as part of that study, a physical analysis is completed with an assessment of each item to determine its remaining life. As planners, we use kind of the normal expected life and then make adjustments based on its condition. Reserve fund estimates are subjective. They're based on the planner's understanding of the life cycle of building components and their experience gained from observing buildings. We are giving you our best guess. The study is a financial document based on a visual inspection of a sampling of the components where feasible, and also based on an interview with directors or agents of the corporation. The basic study does not include any detailed condition assessments or invasive investigations. So there are limitations to the study. All or some of the common elements may require repair or replacement prior to the time estimated in the study, and the cost of such repair or replacement could exceed the estimated costs. We are generally only looking at the building every 6 years, so a lot can happen or not happen in that time. The reserve fund expenditure plan is not intended to be dogmatically followed. In essence, the targeted expenditures are guidelines, and the board still needs to decide to do the work and when to do the work. Now, that is not an easy decision. What do you need to consider? The decision should involve a risk assessment, first on safety. So has the structure been compromised and is something going to collapse? Will someone slip or trip or fall? Will there be a fire or explosion? Will someone suffer health complications from poor air quality, excessive heat, or excessive cold? All things to consider. And second, will there be any secondary damage and see an escalation in costs? Will this lead to water penetration and deteriorate components normally protected from roofing membranes or sealants or some other building envelope component? Will the deterioration penetrate deeper, and instead of just dealing with surface patching of concrete, it becomes full depth slab replacement requiring additional shoring and maybe rebar replacement? So third, maybe for commercial properties, should also consider, will there be business interruption or financial loss? So once the hazards, assets at risk, and impacts have been identified, what is the plan? Perhaps the work can be phased to address immediate concerns first, or maybe you can achieve deferral with just doing some localized repairs. In weighing those decisions, remember, under Section 37 of the Act, a director is not liable if relying in good faith upon a report or opinion from a professional. So if you are looking to prolong the life of capital assets, essentially deferring replacement work, make sure to hire an engineer to help develop that program. They are going to complete a detailed condition assessment and give you options. Sonja alluded to this. Keep in mind, if this professional involvement is being done proactively, well in advance, there will be more options. So now let's hear from some of those professionals.
Thanks, Chris. And the importance of making sure that you're reaching out to professionals when you're going to be making a decision about whether to defer or not is so important, because that's what offers that protection to directors. All right, so now we are going to really focus on three main areas of a condo. So we're going to be talking about mechanical building systems, concrete and building cladding and window systems specifically. And to start us off, Jeff Livingstone from Prolong Engineering is going to talk about mechanical building systems and his thoughts on, can you actually prolong it? What are things to think about? What can you do? And whether it's a good idea. So, Jeff, what do you think about prolonging common elements when it comes to mechanical building systems?
Yeah, it's definitely a decision that you can look into, and that with, again, to keep reiterating, if you're proactive and you take the time in advance to do the studies and do the research, there are opportunities to try to prolong the life of equipment and very expensive replacements. So just a brief background, I'm Jeff Livingstone from Prolong Engineering. I lead the mechanical engineering division. And mechanical engineering with Prolong, we kind of end up being on both sides of the coin for condominiums, because we are involved in reserve fund studies. We do the investigations and help to populate the tables and work on the replacement costs. And secondly, we get involved in doing the design work for the planned replacements and sometimes unplanned replacements. So just briefly, typical condominium buildings have 3 or 4 major system replacement projects in the mechanical side. Boiler and chiller, the heating and cooling system replacements, the actual major equipment is either in the penthouse or in the basement of the building. Suite fan coil unit replacements, or heat pump type units, or perimeter radiation heating units, however the buildings are set up. Those are the more invasive and in-suite replacements, which can be anywhere from $500,000 to $5 million, depending on the extent of the size of your building and whether riser piping is being replaced at the same time as equipment. Another big one and an invasive one is domestic water riser replacement, which again affects suites. That's particularly kitchens, bathrooms. Tiles often have to be removed, vanities are removed, countertops, equipment. So that one again is one that if you can try to avoid or push it off, again, if you can do it every 50 years instead of every 40 years, there's definitely advantages to that. So I want to talk about 2 projects that we have worked on. One was the first we'll talk about is domestic water. So we had a condo approach us. The reserve fund study said that their domestic water risers were in need of replacement. They were 50 years old. So according to typical lifespans, it was time. We ended up doing a feasibility study for them, and when we were in the building and discussing with a property manager, one thing that jumped out at us, they had said they had never had a single pinhole leak or pipe failure in the building in 50 years, which was surprising. They'd had some valve issues, those were replaced. So we recommended to them that we take our investigation a little bit further and do ultrasonic pipe thickness testing. And we had, it was, in this case, it was 2 buildings, 2 20-story condos. And the pipe thickness testing was undergone. We measured thickness in all different areas of the building, at the top of the building, the bottom, typical risers. And the results came back from that testing, and we were surprised to find the thickness of the piping was actually equal to, and in some cases thicker than, the gauge of new piping that we would have installed today. So I won't get into the details of it. It has a little bit to do with how piping was manufactured 50 years ago versus today. Basically, they don't make things like they used to. So with that in mind, we had an original cost estimate of just shy of $6 million to do 2 buildings, full replacement of the risers. What we ended up recommending is that we revisit this in coming approximately 5 years or so. They were going to put in a water treatment system to help just maintain the piping that was there. And what they were left with was a major parking garage project that they really couldn't afford because they had a $6 million domestic water riser replacement that they were able to undertake sooner. And we're now again looking at this $6 million project that will be put off 5 years. Presumably 5 years from now, we can do it again, another 5 years. And this was just an opportunity for a building that really could have gone in blindly, done a major renovation, but because they were willing to take the time, do the study, again, they're now pushing off this this major project for some number of years now. So that was definitely an excellent win. And again, being proactive turned out to be a very valuable resource there. Now, another project, I wanted to describe this one because it illustrates kind of what can happen when you have not planned for something to fail. There is a building. This is a 22-story building, 330 units. Typical building, heating and cooled using a chiller and boiler system. In the penthouse of this building, they had a chiller that was 12 years old. The chiller had never had a major overhaul. So if in a typical reserve fund, we'll have a major equipment replacement, for example, a chiller, which might be $500,000, $300,000, but there'll be a fairly costly overhaul that you'll see usually at a sort of the mid-span of the life, approximately 12 to 15 years. It can be between $75,000 to $150,000, depending on the size and the number of chillers. Many property managers and condo board members have asked me, do I need to do this? They see it come up, it'll be in the reserve fund, and the maintenance contractor will send them a quote. And the answer is and should be yes, you should do this. And a good analogy is this is similar to changing the oil in your car. There's nothing wrong with the chiller. It's working properly, but it is very good to have somebody open up the hood, take a look, change the oil. It's similar to what they're doing, but in looking at it, they may be able to identify any issues that are coming up, or things like replacing bearings, replacing seals, replacing things will ensure that the chiller will continue to perform as it should for the next 15 years. This building was right at that point. It was about the time it should have done that maintenance. It hadn't come up yet. It actually wasn't in the reserve fund, and this really was no one's fault. But what ended up happening, the chiller had a bearing failure, and then the impeller in the chiller, one of the major components, just seized, cracked, broke. It basically destroyed the machine or a component of the machine. This was in June. Chiller shut down. They could not use it. There's nothing they could do. Parts were ordered. It was going to be about 4 months and around $175,000 to repair the chiller. During that time, almost immediately, all the south-facing windows of this building, or all the south-facing condos, were seeing temperatures upwards of 90 degrees in their building. We didn't really have a choice. The building actually got a temporary chiller, had to hook it up, and set up a whole system so they had some form of cooling because the building was basically becoming untenable. The cost to this was $11,000 per week, and they had to have this for close to 6 months. So it was about a $250,000 rental chiller that had to be in place. The property manager the stress level of the property manager was absolutely through the roof. He was, taking calls every day from multiple people. When this had happened, the condo board were calling us constantly. We got involved in trying to solve the problem. Every day, what can we do? It's $11,000 a week. Can we get a new chiller? Can we get parts? Do we replace it? What do we do? So again, in this case, this wasn't necessarily from not being proactive, but what can happen if a piece of equipment fails that was not correctly maintained? You just end up with a difficult situation in the building and significant cost. Again, a replacement chiller in this building would have been approximately $350,000 to $400,000. They spent almost $400,000 repairing and providing a temporary unit. So the real takeaway here is that it's very important to maintain your equipment, and again, proactively make sure you're taking those steps. Your reserve fund typically will tell you when you want to do those things, and keeping in mind those time frames and that type of work that needs to be done, should be done, because again, planning can save you money, make sure you've done things in the past. Things that happen that are unplanned, or a failure of something that was pushed off perhaps too long, can be catastrophic, extremely expensive, and very difficult on the suite owners and the property management as well. So I'll leave it at that on the mechanical side, just inside of 10 minutes.
Thanks, Jeff. There was a question about, could you repeat the testing that needs to be done for domestic water risers that you mentioned?
Yeah, so what it was is ultrasonic testing. So if you want to get an idea of how your piping looks, there are two ways of doing it. You can isolate a section, have a contractor cut that section of piping out. You can take a look at it physically, you can see it, you can measure the thickness. But ultrasonic testing just uses ultrasonic waves. You attach a device to the outside of the piping. It basically bounces signals through, and they measure it on 4 sides, and you actually get a reading on the thickness of the steel in the piping. So that can be used to compare the thickness of the piping versus expected kind of erosion rates for a piping its age and against new piping.
Thanks.
So, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's all. So
Okay.
again, in the case of this study, we had done a feasibility study for us to spend 2 more days on site. The contractor with the equipment, and we cut insulation out, put it back on. It was around $8,500 was the cost to do this for 2 towers, to give an idea. And again, that ended up pushing a $6 million project off by presumably as much as 10 years.
This ultrasonic testing is getting a lot of interest. There's another question about, does this testing apply to stack risers and drains?
It can, yep, it can be used for any type of riser. Typically, yeah, it will work with cast iron, copper, or steel.
All right, and one more question about hot water risers, and then we'll move on to Jeremy, who's going to talk about concrete. The question was, physical condition of the hot water risers in my building suggests that the pipes still have good thickness left, but are 55 years old. Is it time to think about phase-wise replacement?
Yes, for sure, it's time to think about it. And that's a perfect scenario where you may want to check the piping if you haven't had failures. And again, that 50-year-old piping seems to be better than the new piping we're putting in. And there are also, if the piping is structurally sound, if it's not sort of become so thin, there are injection type systems that actually put a film in to actually protect the piping and prolong its lifespan, which can work as long as the piping is physically in good enough condition to do it. So there are definitely options, and yeah, it's worth looking into now rather than when you start having leaks and you don't have those options.
Thanks, Jeff. And those were some really great questions. Don't forget, if you have questions for our panelists, put them into the Q&A box. We're going to try and answer them through the webinar or at the end of the webinar if we still have some time. And the panelists are going to be taking a look at these questions in any event. So get your questions into the Q&A box. We're going to try and answer them, but we've got to move on. And Jeremy Nixon from Brown & Beatty is going to talk to us about concrete. And again, the same issues. Can we do something to prolong this common element? And what are the things that we need to think about? Jeremy?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Sonja. Great panel so far. Thanks, Chris and Jeff, for that. Yeah, we've heard a little bit from Chris about the inflation state of things. While it's coming down, it's still pretty high, and that's undoubtedly putting pressure on our reserve funds. I'm going to talk about concrete, and mostly in the context of balconies and garages, as those tend to be the pieces in condominiums that are the most significant. But it could be any other concrete, maybe shear walls as well, sometimes to a degree, or those floor bands, or maybe some other structure. But mostly we're going to think about balconies and garages. What we're seeing is that even though inflation is starting to temper, the actual construction prices are not, or at least if you're looking at your construction prices from one reserve fund study to the next, you're going to see a big jump. There's no two ways around that, and that's, I think, where a lot of this pressure is coming in, and putting deferrals maybe more on the table than ever. There was perhaps a time in the past where deferral was, and it still is, a strategy that you have to look at carefully in terms of the overall pros and cons of it. But increasingly, we're seeing that deferring may not be as good a strategy, at least in the realm of concrete, as it once was, because the costs are tending to escalate at greater rates than are often carried in reserve fund studies. So not to mention that concrete has, as I'll talk about in a little bit, has the potential to get exponentially worse in time. So the longer you defer it, the more. It's not like it's a linear state of disrepair that happens. It's sometimes quite exponential. But there's a couple ways to look at concrete. Kind of two factors. First of all, structurally. So when we think of concrete in that vein, when you go around your garages or balconies, this is delamination and spalling, so detachment of those pieces. So if those pieces of concrete are not yet falling off, or they're not large, maybe you have some opportunity to look at deferral a little bit, keeping in mind some of the other things I'll touch on in a moment. If it's, I'm going to flash a few pictures here quickly. If your concrete looks like this, there's no deferring on this. It's too late. The only deferral might be is just to knock off loose concrete long enough to allow yourself to get organized to do the repairs that are needed. It looks like this. I mean, this is a well-kept garage, of course, but within this there might be a bit of leakage here or there, or a bit of concrete delamination. But if it's on a smaller scale, sure, then you have a little bit more time to think about it. This is the balconies. So if we have some concrete detachment happening here, maybe what we can't quite see through the whole of the photo, but if you look closely along here, this entire edge is cracked, so there might not be much deferral there. You might actually want to come across this and try to knock off that loose concrete if it's looking imminent, just so it can come down in a more controlled fashion, especially in balconies. Not that in garages it's any better, but you don't want that concrete to fall, especially like on a busy streetscape in an uncontrolled manner, if you can help it. So there's perhaps less options in some cases than others. If it's a bit of a financial crunch, you've got to organize yourself. Sure, you've got to do what you've got to do in the meantime, just to bridge that short or that immediate term gap. The other side of concrete to think about is some of that was serviceability, but digging a little bit deeper into the technical side of it, again, the longer you leave things unrepaired, the worse they can get. It can be, and not on just a linear basis, as I said, but exponentially. When we're talking concrete, and specifically with the mechanisms that cause this kind of detachment that we just looked at, it's the as many of you I'm sure know, it's the corrosion of the steel, the embedded steel, that gets worse over time, and it's sometimes a little bit of a sight unseen, but left to its own devices, that just gets worse and worse at a quicker rate than deferral would perhaps let you think you can get away with. And waterproofing's coming to the mix, certainly, in that vein. So if your waterproofing is not kept in good condition, it doesn't have to be pristine all the time, but if it's not kept in reasonably good condition, especially in garages, where we also bring salts into the garages off the vehicles, like that really can cause the steel to deteriorate at an accelerated rate, especially if the waterproofing is not intact. And the exterior components, like we add salt or throw road salt and everything. So give a little bit of thought to maybe where where you do that kind of stuff, or where you throw that. There's alternatives to chloride salt. There's other de-icing alternatives. They're costly, but the operational cost might save some of the capital costs big time later on, at least but just by extending the time of the useful life of the element. Another thought on older garages, and I want to go back to kind of around the 80s or 90s, 1980s and 90s. There was a time that some in the webinar might recall that we didn't even waterproof our garages, at least the interior garages, anyways, the interior slabs. But we started to learn, kind of in that era of the 80s and 90s, that was a really bad thing, because now we have those slabs directly exposed to these road salts, especially. So anyone who has operated on or operates one of those older buildings, you've probably gone through at least one major restoration, and potentially to the extent of replacing entire slabs outright. Those are a whole other animal. If you are, and they're waterproofed now, certainly since then, but they're at a bit of a lifetime disadvantage, unfortunately, because unless they've had their slab replaced totally, because if they hasn't been totally replaced, you'll still have those embedded chlorides in those unrepaired areas that can continue to do their thing over time. But with a good waterproofing system on it, you're at least limiting the introduction of new salts. On newer buildings than that, we've been waterproofing since brand new for at least 25 or 30 years at this point. So the strategies in those buildings are perhaps a little bit different. And what we're seeing increasingly is there is more emphasis on local repair of the waterproofing, perhaps at more regular intervals. There seemed to be a time where we just let our garages go to hell, and then we jump on the repair and bite the big one. Increasingly, I'm seeing that's less of a case, and we're not seeing quite to the same degree as we did maybe 15 or 20 years ago, those large full restoration projects. But we're seeing a lot more iterative slices of local repair, and that can still be substantial. We could still be talking large slices of the garage, but instead of those major ones every 15 to 20 or 25 years, or maybe every 5 years, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it's a little bit more waterproofing focused and less concrete focused, because I think there's some increased understanding that leaving your concrete unprotected exposes it to some of this accelerated deterioration potential. So I would say that understanding how exponentially damaging unprotected concrete can be should factor into some of the early thinking. And as we've heard from Chris and Jeff both, that sometimes seeing these things in advance can really help you defray some of the bad things that can happen later on.
Thanks, Jeremy. There is a question in the Q&A box under the answer tab about winter salting and effects, and you kind of answered it in your presentation, but you might want to take a look at it and see if there's anything else you want to add to that. But there was a question specifically about painting concrete and whether that should be avoided at all costs or whether that's a good idea. Jon chimed in on the Q&A box and answered and gave his perspective, but I'm going to ask you your perspective, and then Jon, if you have anything else you want to add to your answer, I'll give you a chance after that. So what do you think about that, Jeremy? Is that a good strategy, or should we not be painting our concrete?
No, I don't have a problem with painting in concrete. Frankly, in some jurisdictions, when we're talking garages, it's mandated to paint the concrete. It's sometimes aesthetic. You can be seen as that, but not completely. Like with a painted garage, actually can help with other things like illumination, especially. She takes off some of the gloom. From a technical reviewer perspective, it actually allows us who do the technical review of garages to see leakage perhaps a little simpler. You can see it on that white canvas a little bit better than the gray concrete canvas. So it's not a bad idea. And again, it's mandated in certain scenarios. On balconies, it's maybe a little bit of a different story, because we're not we don't see them aggressively deteriorate quite at the same rate or the same degree as garages. Not that it doesn't have some of that same benefit, but it's definitely a bit more of a cosmetic consideration in that case, I would say. But the same principles apply. It still can allow you to identify some of those early those leaking areas, a little bit easier perhaps. But sometimes you actually want to paint on the other side just because leaving that that old leakage staining behind. Sometimes it's a bit of a red herring for investigators coming in later on if they see that. Maybe not fully understanding whether that's old leakage or current leakage. And so kind of covering that over to give that blank canvas again can help future investigators. But it does then become an ongoing capital cost that you have to keep on top of.
All right. And John, do you want to add anything to that? You talked about a breathable coating in your answer. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I always tend to see things in terms of walls rather than parking garages. So I was saying if it was the outside of a concrete building, be careful of just traditional exterior paint. You don't want to be trapping moisture if it's a wall system. I was talking about adding a breathable coating might be more applicable in that scenario.
All right, thanks. And John, we're going to pass this off to you now. So Jon Dickson is from Prolong Engineering, and he's going to talk about building cladding and window systems. And again, same issues, John. Is there anything we can do to sort of prolong the life of these common elements? And what are the things that we should be thinking about if we're going to be making those kind of decisions?
Right. Hey, thank you for inviting me back to speak to CCI Huronia. My name is Jon Dickson, project principal at Prolong Engineering, and I'm taking the context of speaking about this topic for window and wall systems. Majority of my life, I've been looking at window systems, so that is what the focus generally when I speak. I have a lot of window-related examples. So I've always been kind of a realist when it comes to setting project budgets. So sometimes I'm seen as the bearer of bad news, because Chris put it pretty well, that reserve funds are based on the planner's understanding of the work. And not everyone is as well versed as Chris is. So maybe the understanding is not the same across the industry, because a reserve fund it should be treated as a tool, but it's not gospel. It's not saying that's what your project is going to cost. So too often I get engaged for a pre-design assessment or a design process, and I provide them an estimate of how much this is going to cost, and there's a significant shortfall. And that's really why we're all here today, is what happens when you have that shortfall. And I would like to talk about the three options I tend to see when I'm dealing with window and wall systems, and provide examples of each. And in some cases they're a success story, in some cases not so much. So you got this big bill, it's way more than you thought it was going to be. What do you do? Well, the first option, I'd call it the scramble option. You've been putting this work off for long enough as it is. Now you have an example where the cost is coming significantly more than anticipated, but you still have to do the work. So you delay the work slightly. We're talking slightly 1 to 2 years. You're scrambling to try to find the money. Where do I get it? Do I go for a special assessment? Do I go for a loan from a lending institution? That's the scramble option. That's where we're hoping to avoid. The next one would be the deferral option. So deferring all of the work to a future year. Now this has to be done carefully, which we'll talk about shortly. And then the third option is kind of like a hybrid. You do some of the work now, the mandatory component, you break that out. That's what you can afford. That's what you do now. And you defer the rest for a future year. So the first example from recent experience I like to talk about is the delay option. It was a project which is at Bay and Bloor in downtown Toronto. We were called in to do the window replacement design. They said, we have the money, just go to design and proceed to tender. I did slow them down. I said, let's plan for this. Let's do a pre-design assessment. I'll give you an updated budget. We'll make sure we have enough. Turns out the reserve fund that they've been planning for decades this is a $3 million, just over $3 million exercise, according to the reserve fund. And when I came in, we gave our pre-design assessment. We were thinking it would be around $6.5 million. Now, this was huge sticker shock for them. It's more than twice what they have in the reserve fund, and it's very difficult to raise $3.5 million. So in this case, they've been putting off the windows for so long. They have leakage in several units. Condensation is well rampant in the building. They have overheating on the south, and everyone's freezing on the north. These windows have to get replaced. There was no realistic or way to defer this project by doing localized repairs. So they went through the borrowing bylaw process. Now, this is a cautionary tale. If you are the project manager, property manager, or board member for a building which is highly dependent on rentals, so close to universities, schools, etc., passing a borrowing bylaw in your building can be a very difficult process. Just achieving quorum can be very difficult. In this case, the majority of the units were owned by people in other countries. They did not live here. And trying to get them all together and voting for a borrowing bylaw, it took them over 2 years. So these windows are having major issues. Residents are coming daily to this poor property manager. They can't do anything because it's taken them over 2 years to pass the borrowing bylaw to get the money to do the work. So this is the root cause of all of this example is just poor planning. If you see a major capital expenditure coming up within the next few years, you should be I would recommend you conduct a condition assessment to get what the real value is. Because remember, the reserve fund is a tool. Find out what the real value is, make sure that if you do have to scramble, you have time to do so without negatively impacting the building. The next option would be deferral. So this is a different example where they're deferring capital expenditure to a future year. This is a project of 3 towers on the lake, Lake Ontario, downtown Toronto. It's a very large project or complex, so there's over 1,000 units. And their reserve fund historically had been set up for replacement on an as-needed basis. Now, this is, I would not always, some cases this might work. In this case, it was not working for this building. They had window replacement in the reserve fund on an as-needed basis. So they were getting to the point where it was needed. And so we have 1,000 units across these 3 buildings. And they're starting to leak one after another, and one unit gets replaced, another gets replaced, etc., until they exceed their allowance for that year. But now we have an issue of equality within the building. You have residents saying, why are their windows replaced, and why are my windows not replaced? And you get kind of a pockmarked exterior as well. So from street level, the building, you can tell what's new and what's old because they don't match each other. So ultimately, the corporation decided this is too much. We have to replace all of them at once. So making that decision at this stage, it means that all the replacements they just did, most of which can't be reused, that capital is lost. But ultimately, they haven't been planning for this, and a reserve fund of this, an item of this size is well over $10 million, and they have to generate that capital. So they contacted Pretium to come in to do a condition assessment to find out what is a reasonable time frame to defer this line item. And we came in and looked at the pattern, and it was 5 to 7 years we could comfortably say that you could defer this. So they have over 5 to 7 years, there's a substantial increase to the reserve fund contributions required, but this was a way in which they were able to get away from the localized replacement approach and go to a wholesale replacement approach. For the first example, we talked about the fact that it took 2 years to pass that borrowing bylaw. What this means is that it kind of has a snowball effect because, as we all know, reserve funds they're spaced out, so there's not too much capital work in a single year. By delaying the windows by 2 years, now the podium deck waterproofing is happening in the same year, which wasn't feasible. So they contacted Pretium to come in to do a condition assessment of that podium deck. So deferral of a large capital expenditure should not be taken lightly. The board wanted to just defer this project, but we're saying that because this has potentially structural consequences, if that waterproofing leaks and causes damage to the structural components, it could be significant, as Jeremy was just talking about. So we came in, did a condition assessment. We found by doing test pits, poking, prodding, pulling on the membrane, that a 5-year deferral seemed reasonable. It was performing better than expected based on its service life. So the board was able to take that professional opinion and use it to support the decision to defer to make the reserve fund work for them. The final option is the change in the scope. So again, you're hit with a major bill, you can't pay it all. You get back to first principles. Why is this work happening? Is it happening because the reserve fund told you so, or is it happening because there's actually a problem in the building? This is a large development at Steeles and Young, and 2 towers, 400 units. Again, it was another window replacement project. Is the window replacement happening because just because the reserve fund said so? Well, no, it was happening because there was widespread leakage from the perimeters of the windows. Several residents were complaining about the visual appearance from the exterior. There was corrosion, aluminum oxide on the window frames, and there were some hardware issues with the sliding windows. So they weren't able to replace their windows when the tenders came in. It was more than double what they had planned. But they got back to first principles. They said, okay, we can potentially defer this window replacement project by up to 10 years, according to Pritium, according to our consulting engineer, as long as the following is executed. So full replacement of the sealant around the window, rejuvenate the exterior through the painting that would address the corrosion, the premature corrosion, and localized replacement of the hardware. And so by undertaking a project that was less than 1/8 the cost of the replacement, they were able to defer the replacement 10 years and generate the capital accordingly. Ultimately, if you look at the long term, this is likely a more expensive option because you have to access the exterior of the building twice over 10 years. However, it was really their only option with the financial situation that was in front of them. And a final note on that, when it comes to changing the scope, if you are changing the scope, make sure that you are changing the correct portion of the scope to address your problem. Recent example of a building at Yonge and Eglinton, they had caulking replaced 8 years in. So 8-year-old caulking, typically in a reserve fund, we're looking at about 15 years for sealants. They had all of their sealant replaced because they had leakage through their cladding systems and around windows at multiple locations. They had their caulking replaced for a cost of $800,000. 2 years later, they realized that they still have this leakage occurring. And so they contacted us and we did some investigations and some tests, and we found that the leakage was actually occurring behind the brick. There was a membrane tie-in between the brick and the windows. It wasn't the exterior sealant. But the only way to fix it is to take out everything they just did 2 years ago, pull out the brick adjacent to the windows, and redo the tie-in at a cost of $900,000. Ultimately, they had to do this because the leakage was so significant, but they unnecessarily undertook an $800,000 sealant replacement program, and they can't get that money back. So if you are choosing to modify the scope, make sure you're modifying the right portion of it to address the problems that you have. That's what I have. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And, as always, these webinars fly by so fast. I can't believe we're almost done, but I wanted to come back to Chris because you started us off on this discussion. And I just wanted to sort of reach out and see if you have any sort of last words or thoughts or tips for our viewers today.
For sure. Some great points there from all the panelists. I like the ideas from Jeff about routine maintenance on mechanical and plumbing components, making sure that chiller gets its midlife overhaul. With Jeremy, make sure those concrete components are protected and pay attention to the condition of the waterproofing. John, looking at alternatives like refurbishment and then also getting help to prioritize and identify the actual cause of failure before undertaking work. All great stuff. So once those more detailed assessments are completed, circle back to your reserve planner. I would love to have access to that information, like Jeff's ultrasonic testing on the pipes that support a longer lifespan of those pipes. once we have those reports, we can incorporate that information from and plug in the different options and calculate the impacts on funding needs. Perhaps there is a cash flow issue, like one of John's example, and slight modifications to the expenditure plan will avoid a special assessment. That's perfect. But if the motivation is to keep monthly fees lower, from my experience, just slight deferral of work will not often make much of an impact on paper, just because right now inflation is higher than interest. That said, each case is different, but the more information that's available that we can plug in and see the options, the better.
Thanks, Chris, for a great summary of what we heard today. And, we're going to have to wrap it up. But, two key things that I kind of took away from all the speakers is one, you can't make these decisions on your own. You got to bring the professionals in to help you with that decision making. And two, this is about sort of deferring costs, not eliminating costs. So you may have to spend a little bit of money up front to be able to defer the larger expense down the road. So you need to prepare and budget for that as well. So thank you to all of our panelists today for that great information and for answering the questions as they were popping up in the Q&A box. We were able to get a lot of questions answered. So thank you for doing that. And I also want to take this time once again to thank the sponsors of this webinar. Thank you to Integrity Property Management, Nordic Windows and Doors, Select Path Insurance, Aaliyah Associates Condominium Lawyers, and Aegis for supporting this webinar and for supporting CCI Huronia. Remind everyone, don't forget to check out our website and our events tab for upcoming events and the dates for all of our webinars for 2024. We have set all the dates from now till December. And if you want to join us on our next webinar, that will be in March. And we will be talking about condo governance, conflicts of interest, and director ethics. On February 28th next week, we are going to be running the Director Certificate Program, the 102 Insurance Fundamentals. So there is still time to register for this program if you want to join us. There is still some space available. In April, we will not be having a Lunch and Learn webinar as we are hosting our annual 2-day intensive director's course on April 13th and 14th. Details about this course will be posted to the website shortly, and you'll be able to register online. Our May webinar is going to be discussing the do's and don'ts of filing an insurance claim. So we tend to do insurance as our topic for May. On a yearly basis. So we're going to be looking at insurance claims specifically in this webinar. And then our June webinar is going to be on a topic that has been requested, and that's hoarding. So it's a great example. If you have topics that you want us to discuss and you have an idea for a webinar, please send us an email to admin@ccihuronia.com and let us know what kind of topic you would like us to cover, and we'll try and incorporate those into our webinar schedule. Also, we have planned our in-person brunch and learn event, and the date has now been set for June 12th, and it will once again be at the Barrie Country Club. Details of the event are going to be posted on our website shortly, but I can tell you and give you a sneak peek that the topic is going to be electrifying issues in your condo, and we're going to be discussing safety issues around electric vehicles, electric scooters, and electric bikes. So if you're interested in that topic, or you want to come out for one of our in-person events, join us on June 12th at the Barrie Country Club. If you're not on our email list and you would like to get on our email list, and that's a great way to find out what's happening at CCI Huronia, just send an email to admin@ccihuronia.com. It doesn't cost you anything. You can be added to our email list. Just simply request to be for that to happen, and we will make sure you get on our list. Also, there's lots of information on our website, ccihuronia.com, including our trade directory. So if you're looking for professionals, check out our trade directory. Those are all of our professional members. Don't forget, all of our webinars go from 12 to 1. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website in the next 7 to 10 days. Past recordings are also available there. Check us out on LinkedIn. Check us out on Facebook. Please go to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. Help us get that 1,000 subscriber mark. And don't forget to share our videos and click on the notification bell. And this is your last chance. If you are a property manager and you have not put your name and company name in the chat box to confirm your attendance at today's webinar, please do so before the webinar ends so that we have a record of your attendance. And then just go onto your account on the CMRA RAO website to log your own attendance. Upcoming events at other chapters across Ontario. CCI Toronto is hosting an event called Creating Community with Condo Gardens featuring Frankie Flowers on March 27th. If you want to check that out, go to their website, ccitoronto.org. Golden Horseshoe is doing their Intro to Condos course on February 27th. You can go to their website, cci-ghc.ca, to register. CCI London is hosting an event called Safety and Security on March 21st. You can go to cci-sw.on.ca to get more information. Our friends in Ottawa at CCI Eastern Ontario are hosting an event called Technology in Condos, Apps, Automation, and AI, Part 1 on March 27th. You can go to their website, cci-easternontario.ca, to register. And CCI Grand River is hosting the Director's Certificate Course 108, which is Repair, Maintenance, and Change Fundamentals, which is very appropriate given today's topic. And that's being held on March 1st. So if you want to register for that, cci-grc.ca is where you go to get information. If you want any information about what's happening on a national level, you can always go to the CCI national website, which is cci.ca, and all of the events happening at all of our chapters across the country from coast to coast can be found there at the very bottom of the landing page on the right-hand side. And that's it for us today. So until next time, I'm Sonja Hodis. Thank you for joining us. And from the entire CCI family to yours, wishing you a great weekend. Hope to see you on our next webinar, which is March 22nd, when we discuss condo governance, conflicts of interest, and director ethics. Don't forget, CCI is your condo connection. Thank you, everyone.